Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wanda Austin. My group members are Louisiana DeRup, Trevor Tobin, and Saif Hussein. And today, our topic will be on the role of genetically modified food. Now, firstly, what is genetic modification? Now, genetic modification may be defined as the enhancement or the creation of a favorable characteristic due through the alteration or modification of an organism's genome. And this has been done since the early days of crop cultivation around 10,000 years ago. One example of this is corn, and later on, we'll be getting into more into depth about this corn specifically. Now, some terms that you should be familiar with are GMO, cisgenic, and transgenic. Now, GMO basically stands for genetically modified organism, which, as its name suggests, is an organism who had its genome altered. And cisgenic is basically the term we use to describe an organism who had its genome altered using the genes of organisms that are of the same species, meaning two tomatoes of two tomato plants of different variation were crossbred in order to produce a new hybrid tomato plant. And then you have transgenic, which is basically the introduction of a new organism's gene into another organism. Such as, for instance, if you take an animal gene and insert it into tomato in order to make a new GMO or a new hybrid. Now, a brief history on genetic modification is that it was carried out inadvertently or by accident in the olden days. Coming back to our corn example is one where the corn we know today would not have been existing without what is known as selective breeding, which is a type of genetic modification. Now, going back, there was a grass by the name of Teotensi, which basically had very small kernels. And what persons did was that they took out kernels with desirable characteristics, probably their color or their size of kernel, and they bred them together and they produce more favorable characteristics, which were then repeatedly bred between each other. And eventually, what we have today is corn from the grass, Teotensi. Now, the first organism or animal that was genetically modified using GMO is dogs, whereas for plants, the first genetically modified organism is wheat. Now, in 1973, Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen basically developed a technique which allowed them to extract recombinant DNA from one organism and placed it into another. Whereas the following year, Beatrice Mintez and Rudolf Janisch used that study and then transferred bacterial DNA into mice. And building on those studies, the first genetically modified organism or food was FDA approved in 1982, where a variation of tomato plant, the flavor savor, was approved by the FDA. And what was genetically modified about this tomato was that the gene that caused it to swizzle or become smushy after harvest was rendered inactive. Now, today's generation, as you can see, or I've just went through with you, is much more simpler or more beneficial to genetic modification because we do not have to go through the whole long process of selective breeding where we have to wait multiple generations to get a GMO that we want with desirable characteristics. Instead, we can simply identify the genes that we want, extract it, and then modify other organisms using that one genome that we want. Now, methods of genetic modification are selective breeding, mutagenesis, RNA interference, and transgenesis. Selective breeding, as I have basically explained to you, is the breeding of organism to produce a desirable characteristics. Mutagenesis is basically the exposure of plant seeds to various chemicals and radiation, and whichever one produces a favorable characteristic, we then take that and then carry out selective breeding on it. RNA interface is basically what I've just explained with the flavor savor tomato, where individual genes in an organism are rendered inactive, producing an organism with favorable characteristics that we want. Transgenesis, as I mentioned earlier, is the introduction of an organism of different species into one organism to make a new or stronger organism. Now, it should be noted that transgenesis is the most common type of genetic modification in today's day and age. Some examples of genetic modified food are the corn, which were introduced with bacterial gene, which causes them to produce a bacterial toxin, making them more resistant to pesticides. Then you have cow who have been genetically modified in order to produce human milk instead of the usual cow milk. Then you have tomatoes again, but this time, instead of inactive, they are introduced with a gene that causes them to produce anti-freezing fish protein, which allow them to be which allows them to be grown in more colder climates. Now, the main reason for us genetically modifying our food is for the numerous roles that they play or their advantages, one of which are their appeal. Now, many persons would prefer to eat an apple that is deep red instead of one that is yellow reddish, meaning its color is not that bright. So enough persons or a lot of industries genetically modify their plants and crops in other words to give us a more appealing food. Another advantage is to strengthen their crops. Now, as I previously mentioned, with the tomato plant, helping it to be more resistant to various environmental conditions. You can also genetically modify your plant to make them resistant to not only cold, but hot climates or drought. That is one reason. Now, prolonged shelf life is another advantage. Again, tomato, the flavor savor, where the gene for making them squashy was then rendered inactive, hence giving them a longer shelf life. And making them cheaper is also an advantage because if they have longer shelf life, they can be transported to various places, increasing the market that these crops can be sold at. Additionally, when you genetically modify these plants, they can then produce more fruit or give you more harvest with less input, meaning that you would not always have to put in things like pesticide or fertilizer and so on in order to get a proper yield at the end of the year. Some additional advantages are insect resistant, as I mentioned, with the bacterial toxins that they can produce to ward off insects. They can also be genetically modified to improve their nutritional content. For example, some of the rice species known as golden rice have been genetically modified, in other words, to produce or give more vitamin A to their consumers. Now, finally, an advantage of genetically modified organisms or plants is to decrease global warming or global warming effects. Now, as we know, plants are the main combatants for greenhouse gases such as CO2. Now, if you have more crops that are resistant to more harsh conditions, more harsh environmental conditions such as temperature and drought and so on, you can then grow more plants in different times of the year, and thus they can absorb the CO2 and produce more O2 for us. Now, while there are a lot of pros to this, there are some few cons. For instance, allergic reaction. Now, persons can be allergic to specific animals such as fish, and when you have their DNA being introduced into our food, when a person then eats the food that contains this DNA, they can have an allergic reaction to that specific food. Additionally, this can also give rise to new allergic reaction, whereas the transgenic gene and the current gene of the organism can mix together and thus cause an allergic reaction that would not normally occur with the normal plant or with the transgenic gene, but them together would then give an allergic reaction. Another disadvantage is the production of superbugs. Now, as we know, insects are highly adaptable to their environment, and if in the case they become resistant to, for example, the bacterial toxin, they would then become much more harder to control. Now, another disadvantage is antibiotic resistance. Now, for these plants to be genetically modified and introduce bacterial toxins into their gene, they are given some amount of antibacterial resistance. Now, this antibacterial resistance can then be passed on to us, and we ourselves can become resistant to various antibiotics, making our immune system weak or vulnerable to various illnesses. Finally, lower level of biodiversity can be a result of genetically modifying our food. Now, if we are successful in producing plants that are completely resistant to insects, then we would have these insects not have enough food source and would eventually die off. And the organisms which depend on these insects as a food source would then die off again, thus reducing our biodiversity on the planet Earth. And with that, I then come to the end of our presentation, and these are our references. I thank you for your time.